2 days before my 68th birthday, my daughter, Danica, looked me in the eye and told me the greatest gift I could give her was to die at a nursing home. She said it without flinching, without hesitation, as though those words had been rehearsed in the mirror. I can still hear the sharpness in her tone, cutting deeper than any knife ever could. You raise a child thinking your sacrifices will be remembered in moments of gratitude, but in that instant, all I heard was contempt. Not just contempt for me as a mother, but contempt for my very existence. It happened in the kitchen of the house I paid for. My hands were still damp from rinsing a plate when she walked in, scrolling on her phone, half smiling at something that had nothing to do with me. I asked her what she was planning for the weekend, a simple question, just small talk between a mother and daughter. And she snapped, "Why don't you just go die at the nursing home? That'd be the greatest gift you could give me." The plate slipped from my hand, shattering in the sink, but it wasn't the sound of breaking glass that echoed in me. It was her voice, my child's voice, treating my life like it was disposable, like I was a bill she wanted to cancel. I stood there in silence, unable to move. Her husband, Quentin, was in the next room, and even he froze when he heard it. He didn't rush in to defend me, didn't challenge her words. He just sat in his chair, staring at the television, as though silence might erase what had just been spoken. But silence never erases anything. It only seals it. I wish I could say I shouted back, that I defended myself, that I reminded her of the nights I worked double shifts so she could wear brand new uniforms at school. I wish I had told her about the overtime hours, the skipped meals, the aching feet that still carried her tuition payments on their back. But my mouth refused to open. I could only stare at her, this woman I had raised, and realize in horror that she had been carrying this bitterness for a long time. My daughter, the child I once rocked to sleep, had already buried me in her heart. The sting wasn't just in the insult. It was in the timing. 2 days before my birthday. 2 days before the one occasion where, for once, I thought I might hear words of appreciation. Instead, she gave me a gift I never asked for, the truth about how she saw me. A burden, a nuisance, an inconvenience she wished to erase. That night, I sat alone in my room, staring at the ceiling, and I let myself feel the weight of what she had said. I thought about every birthday cake I had baked for her, the way I saved for her prom dress, the way I stood in the front row of her college graduation cheering louder than anyone else. None of it mattered now. All she saw was a woman too old, too inconvenient, too unnecessary to her life. But here is what Danica didn't know. Her words didn't destroy me. They transformed me. They ripped away the veil I had wrapped around her, the excuses I had made for her selfishness, the blind love that made me forgive what I should have confronted years ago. She thought she was pushing me closer to death with her cruelty, but what she did was awaken me to life, a life where I no longer lived to make hers easier. In that moment, a seed was planted. I didn't know what form it would take, but I knew this. If my daughter believed my disappearance would be her greatest gift, then I would give it to her, not through death, not through surrender, but through absence so complete it would starve her of the very privileges she had always taken for granted. 2 days before my birthday, my only child reduced me to nothing. What she didn't realize was that nothing is the best place to begin again. I have a ledger no one's ever seen. Not the kind with ink and columns. Mine is stamped in wrists that still ache when it rains. in soles worn thin from floors that never stop asking for your steps. If you want to know how a mother becomes a bank, a shelter, a reputation, a second chance, sit with me while I open the pages. I raised Danica alone. There were no lullabies from a father down the hall, no second paycheck to soften the months that came hard. It was my name on everything: lease, light bill, daycare contract. And when checks cleared, it was my signature that made it so. I worked where the lights never went out, hospital corridors humming like a hive, monitors chirping, phones begging. Day shift bled into night shift, and night into those strange blue hours when even the vending machines looked tired. I learned the rhythm of other people's emergencies and found a way to still pack lunches with notes folded small. You can do this. I wrote that to her and to myself. When Danica was 6, I stood outside a school office with a money order tucked in my bra for safety, telling a registrar I'd have the rest by Friday. I did. The Friday after that, too. Private school didn't happen because I had extra. It happened because I let my own life shrink to fit it. My blouses lasted longer than they should have. My car's check engine light became a companion. And I learned how to turn canned food into love that smelled like Sunday. At night, I ironed uniforms until pleats held a line the world would respect, even when it didn't respect the woman holding the iron. Middle school brought new math and new expenses. I worked weekends that swallowed Saturdays whole, took on clerical hours on top of patient rounds, and smiled at supervisors who pretended my stamina was ordinary. I cut my hair short because mornings needed my minutes. When field trips showed up with fees, I was the mother who just sent it in, never mentioning that I'd cashed out my last bit of overtime to do it. I kept my ledger quiet. Children shouldn't hear the price of their childhood while they're living it. High school was a parade of fundraisers, dances, and the first long gown that made her inhale at her reflection. I stood behind her with pins and pride, catching the hem while thinking about the extra shift I had picked up to pay for it. I clapped the loudest at award ceremonies where they called her name as if it had always belonged on some list. Afterwards, when the cameras went away, I would sit in my car and let the silence wash the adrenaline off. Then I'd go back to work. College opened like a jaw. Books, housing, meal plans, lab fees, bite after bite after bite. FAFSA and scholarships helped, but the gaps were wide and regular like teeth. I bridged them with every tool I had. A small inheritance from my mother parceled out like medicine, retirement contribution paused for just one semester, credit cards that promised points and delivered interest. I kept her phone on, her laptop working, her winter coat warm enough to walk across campus without complaint. When she called, I picked up. You'd be amazed how many crises yield to a calm voice at 2 a.m. and a transfer posted by sunrise. The wedding came like weddings do, soft language, hard invoices. Venues speak in deposits, florists in retainers, photographers in packages named after sunsets. I paid the ones that would make her day look like the life she told everyone she had. I didn't mind. I have never been cheap with beauty when it comes to my child. I watched Danica walk down an aisle and saw every overtime hour turn into light. After the honeymoon photos faded into frames, I watched the numbers. Mortgage due on the 1st, utilities on the 15th, groceries forever. Quentin Hollins worked, steady, responsible, but steady and responsible in this country still meets ceilings. When the month came up short, I made it long. I set up autopay on their house because stability shouldn't depend on who remembered to press submit. I added Danica to a card because emergencies happen. Then I taught myself to call everything an emergency so she wouldn't be ashamed of using it. The ledger grew heavier, but I carried it like a mother carries at the hip without asking who else's arms are free. When Micah was born, I stocked their pantry like a storm was coming, and it did diapers, formulas, pharmacy runs at hours when the parking lot feels like a confession. I spent nights rocking him while Danica slept a rare 12 hours. And I'd whisper the same line I'd whispered to his mother. You can do this. I bought a crib that didn't wobble, a stroller that folded with one hand, a car seat without compromise. I learned which brand of wipes didn't bite his skin, and which lullaby he liked in the second half of the song. If love is measured, let it be measured in items that never make Instagram. People imagine sacrifice as a single grand gesture, a scene with music. It isn't. It's repetition. It's showing up when the plot doesn't ask for you. It's the way I learned the sound of their washer off balance and came by with quarters and quiet. It's changing my own appointment to take Micah to his when schedules collided. It's picking up envelopes from the mailbox before Danica saw the red ink and felt small. There were moments, small ones, when the ledger bent. A comment here, and I roll there, a you wouldn't understand, tossed out like crumbs. The first time she apologized, and I told her no apology was necessary. The 5th time, I told myself she was stressed. The 10th, I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, hands open on my knees, feeling the weight of a life that had narrowed to the outline of another person's. Then I set my alarm for 4 a.m. and went to work. I am not bragging. I am accounting. There is a difference. Bragging asks for applause. Accounting asks for clarity. Before anyone calls me unforgiving, hear the numbers. Tuition covered, rent covered, wedding covered, mortgage auto-paid, groceries, utilities, insurance deductibles, holiday flights, daycare deposits, refinancing fees. Hundreds of small rescues that looked like nothing from the outside because I made them look like nothing. That is the trick of competent women. We make scaffolding invisible, so the building looks inevitable. And if you ask me why I did it, I'll tell you, because I believed in future returns that weren't money. Because I wanted to be the mother I didn't have the luxury of having. Because I thought sacrifice teaches gratitude by osmosis. I was wrong about that last part. Gratitude needs friction. It needs to hear the story of the price. I spared her that. I spared her the story so completely that she thought there wasn't one. So when Danica told me to go die at the nursing home, it landed not in a vacuum, but on a ledger already dense with entries. That sentence didn't start our story. It indexed it. It linked every sacrifice to its outcome and wrote, in a hand I recognized but had never named, a truth I could no longer unsee. I had taught my daughter that love was a bottomless well and that the bucket would always come up full. The rest of this tale, what I turned off, what I revealed, where I went, would not exist without this chapter. Know this page before you turn to the next. Nothing I did later was sudden. It was arithmetic reaching its answer. If you think my daughter's words, "Go die at the nursing home," came out of nowhere, you don't know how cracks work. Walls don't collapse in an instant. They whisper first. They shift, tremble, and split in hairlines so fine you convince yourself it's nothing. You paint over them. You tell yourself the foundation's still strong. But one day the whole house tilts, and you realize the disaster had been rehearsing all along. The first crack came the summer Danica was 14. I remember standing in line at the mall, holding 2 pairs of shoes in my arms. One was the pair she begged for, the kind that cost half my paycheck. The other was decent, sturdy, still stylish. She glanced at the cheaper pair and said, with a smirk, "You can keep those for yourself, Mom. I'm not going to wear charity-looking shoes." It stung, but I told myself she was just a teenager, mouthy, insecure, finding her place. I bought the expensive pair, walked out of that store with my feet aching in old shoes, convincing myself it wasn't disrespect, just youth. The second crack came during her high school graduation. I sat in the front row, sweating under the June sun, clutching my camcorder like it was gold. When she walked across that stage, her eyes didn't search for me. They scanned the bleachers, the teachers, the friends waving, but not me, the woman who had stayed up countless nights sewing hems, filling out applications, counting pennies. Later, at dinner, she posted photos with captions like, "Thanks to everyone who believed in me." Everyone, except the one person who paid the bill at the end of the meal. The third crack showed itself after her engagement to Quentin. They stood in my living room, showing off a ring I helped finance, and Danica said, half joking but sharp enough to cut, "Mom, don't wear anything too bright at the wedding. You'll make me look cheap." I laughed it off, but the way Quentin shifted in his seat told me it wasn't just a joke. It was a directive. I swallowed it like I'd swallowed all the others, telling myself she didn't mean it, telling myself my presence mattered more than my pride. Then came Micah's birth. When the nurse handed me that baby, my heart cracked open in a way only grandmothers understand. I offered to stay for a few weeks to help. Danica leaned against her hospital bed, eyes heavy with exhaustion, and said, "Sure, but don't try to act like his mother. He has one already." That sentence could have been soft, could have been practical, but her delivery was a slap. Still, I stayed. I rocked him at night. I changed diapers. I sang lullabies so she could sleep. But the crack widened inside me, whispering, "You're only welcome as long as you're useful." You see the pattern now? Every insult was dressed in casualness, every dismissal tucked into humor, every ungrateful word softened with timing. And every time I excused it, I told myself it was the stress of adolescence, the weight of marriage, the fog of new motherhood. I made excuses because mothers are experts in giving discounts to their children's flaws. I painted over every crack, refusing to see what they were spelling out. But hindsight has a cruel clarity. Looking back, I see how she learned to treat me as a permanent safety net, a parachute that never tears no matter how recklessly she jumped. She knew I'd always pay the bill, always show up, always fix the mess. And when someone believes you'll never leave, they stop bothering to be kind. So when she finally told me to go die at the nursing home, it wasn't the first stone she threw. It was the wall collapsing, a culmination of years I spent ignoring what was right in front of me. I had trained her not to value me by valuing her above all else. And the truth is, her cruelty on my birthday wasn't shocking. It was inevitable. That's what no one wants to admit about betrayal. It doesn't fall from the sky. It grows in the soil of your own silence. And I had been silent too long. The night it happened, the house was quiet in that heavy way only midnight can bring. Micah's toys sat scattered across the living room floor from my last visit, a reminder of the innocence that tied us all together. I'd made myself a cup of tea, the kind that cools more than it comforts, and opened my laptop to clear out messages. What I found sitting bold-faced in my inbox was not meant for me at all. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a subject line reading regarding Micah Holland's request for access. The name pricked my nerves. I clicked, and there it was, a letter from Reverend Osric Bennett, addressed to Danica, but forwarded accidentally to my account because I was still listed on a joint email chain from years ago. His words were deliberate, pastoral even, but behind the politeness was a plea sharp enough to split me open. My son, Tyrese, has made every effort to respect your wishes, but as Micah grows older, it becomes increasingly difficult for him to accept being shut out of his child's life. He has stood by silently for years, but he is the boy's father, and he deserves to be acknowledged. This silence cannot go on forever. Father, the word leapt at me, burned itself into my chest. I reread the sentence 3, 4 times. My breath caught as the details unspooled. Tyrese claimed he was Micah's biological father. Tyrese, the pastor's son. Tyrese, who had once circled Danica's world in whispers and rumors before her marriage to Quentin. I scrolled further, each line a blade. Danica, you know the truth. You and Tyrese were together before your marriage, and the timeline cannot be denied. Micah deserves to know his heritage, and Tyrese deserves the chance to be his father in more than name alone. I sat frozen. The screen glowed, but the room felt dark, suffocating. My hands trembled so badly I had to set the mug down before it shattered. I leaned closer, rereading every sentence as though repetition might change the words. It didn't. Each time, the truth sharpened. My daughter had built her marriage, her motherhood, her entire reputation on a lie. The more I thought about it, the more the puzzle pieces clicked. Micah's quick conception after the wedding, the way Danica dodged questions about her old relationships, the tension that sometimes surfaced between her and Quentin when timing came up. I had ignored it all, chalked it up to the messiness of young love. But now, in black and white, a pastor himself was confirming what I had refused to see. My chest ached. Betrayal comes in layers. You think you've been cut as deep as it goes. Then the knife twists and proves there's more. My daughter had insulted me, dismissed me, leaned on me, yes. But this was betrayal of blood. She had denied a man his child, deceived her husband into fatherhood, and dragged me unknowingly into protecting a secret I never agreed to keep. I closed the laptop, then opened it again. The words were still there, waiting like a witness that refused to leave the stand. I pressed print, the machine coughing out the pages like confessions on paper, each line a hammer against the pedestal I'd placed Danica on all her life. I pressed my palms to my eyes, but the truth burned even in the dark. My daughter, my only child, had been living in a house of lies, and I was the one paying the mortgage. The sting of her birthday insult had not even healed, and here I was holding evidence that she was capable of far worse than words. That night, I understood something for the first time. Cruelty doesn't come out of nowhere, and entitlement doesn't grow in clean soil. The truth of Micah's paternity wasn't just a secret. It was the rotten core beneath everything Danica had built. And now that I knew it, I couldn't unknow it. She thought her greatest gift to me would be my disappearance. She had no idea that hers would be the unraveling of her own deception. One email forwarded by mistake, exposing the entire house of cards she had stacked so high. And I decided right then I would not let this truth stay buried. Discovery alone doesn't make something true. Anyone can write a letter, spin a tale, stir chaos with words. That's what I told myself. As I lay awake the night, I found the email. My mind wanted to believe it was some misunderstanding, some twisted mistake. But my gut, that stubborn, whispering voice that has saved me more than once, told me otherwise. If I wanted certainty, I would have to drag the truth into the light myself. The next morning, I picked up the phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The number at the bottom of Osric Bennett's email glared up at me like it had been waiting all along. My thumb hovered, then pressed. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello." His voice was calm, deep, the practiced tone of a man used to counseling troubled souls. But he wasn't expecting me. I could hear it in the pause when I introduced myself, Laretha Mays, Danica's mother. His breath caught, almost inaudible, but enough to tell me he hadn't planned for this call. "I got your message," I said, my voice like ice. "The one about my grandson. The one you weren't careful enough to keep from me." Silence stretched, and then Osric sighed, weary. "Mrs. Mays, I was reaching out to your daughter. Not you, but since the truth has reached you, maybe it's time someone told you plainly. My son Tyrese, he is Micah's father. That boy has his blood. Danica knows it." My stomach clenched. Still, words are cheap. I needed more. "If that's true, prove it," I snapped. Osric's answer was simple. "Talk to Tyrese." I did. That same afternoon, I drove across town, pulling up to a modest apartment complex on the edge of the city. Tyrese answered the door. Tall, shoulders broad, the kind of young man whose presence filled a room before he said a word. His eyes, though, were what stopped me, dark, searching, with a sadness that looked older than his years. We sat at a small kitchen table. His hands drummed against the wood, restless. "I didn't want it to go this way," he said before I could even speak. "But I've been shut out too long. Micah is mine. I know it, and deep down, Danica knows it too. I forced him to walk me through it. Every detail. He and Danica had been together before Quentin, on and off, a fire that refused to die. Even when she started courting Quentin, she never cut Tyrese completely loose. The overlap was messy, hidden, deliberate. Then came the pregnancy, conceived in those final blurred months before the wedding. Danica chose convenience, not truth. She married Quentin, let him believe Micah was his, and iced Tyrese out like he was some shadow she could erase. "But look at him," Tyrese said, sliding a photo across the table. It was Micah at 4 years old, grinning with a missing tooth. "That's my smile. My father's nose. You can't tell me otherwise." I wanted to argue, but the resemblance hit me like a blow. Micah's eyes mirrored Tyrese's so perfectly, it was almost cruel. I tried to push it away, tried to cling to the hope that maybe this was all a coincidence. But when Tyrese pulled out messages, old photos, even receipts of times he had been with Danica during those months she claimed to be exclusive with Quentin, the denial drained out of me. By the time I left that apartment, I was no longer a mother clinging to disbelief. I was a witness staring at the corpse of my daughter's honesty. Driving home, the world outside the windshield blurred, lights stretching, streets bending, but inside me, everything was sharp, clear. Micah wasn't Quentin's son. My grandson had been born into a lie my daughter nourished, expanded, and built her entire life upon. And I had helped fund it every step of the way. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the printed email on one side, Tyrese's photo on the other. For years, I had believed I knew my daughter, believed that all her flaws were surface cracks. But what I had uncovered was not a crack. It was the foundation itself, rotten, hollow, deceitful. And as the certainty set in, something else rose inside me. Resolve. If Danica thought she could throw her mother away like a broken toy, if she thought her lies could stay buried under my money, she was wrong. Dead wrong. Because now I knew the truth. And once a mother knows, there's no unknowing. When my daughter told me to go die, she thought she was speaking into the air, tossing venom that would sting and fade. What she didn't realize was that her words landed on a woman who had been holding the strings of her life all along. And once I knew the truth about Micah's paternity, once I saw just how deep the rot of her lies went, I decided those strings would snap, one by one. I started small, quiet, surgical. The first string was the credit cards. Danica had no idea how much of her lifestyle rested on plastic stamped with my name. She thought she was independent, glamorous even, swiping in boutiques and restaurants like she'd earned it. What she never saw were the bank alerts that came to my phone, the payments I made in full so her balances didn't spiral into collections. One by one, I called the banks, my voice steady, my instructions final. Close the account, revoke the authorization, freeze the card. I imagined her at the checkout line, pulling out a card that had always been her golden ticket, only to be told it was worthless. That was the first cut. The second string was the house. That house, 3 bedrooms, a yard just big enough for Micah's toys, a kitchen where she stood to insult me, was never theirs. It was mine. I set up the auto payments years ago, tying my account to their mortgage, so no matter how short Quentin's paycheck fell, they never missed a deadline. Danica believed stability was her birthright. She didn't see it was my lifeline keeping her safe from foreclosure. One call to the bank, one canceled authorization, and the rope snapped. I didn't need to wait to imagine the sound. Letters piling in their mailbox, bold red ink screaming past due, phone calls at dinner time asking for what no longer existed. The third string was every quiet transfer I had ever made. When the fridge broke, when daycare called, when the car needed repairs, I had always stepped in, smoothing out the bumps so their road looked paved. I turned it all off. I told the bank manager to restrict all external transfers, and I closed the side account Danica had grown addicted to dipping into. No more emergencies. No more cushion. For the first time in her adult life, she would feel the ground without padding. As each string snapped, I didn't feel guilty. I felt precise, like a puppeteer, finally releasing the marionette, letting it stumble to see if it could stand without the hidden hand. For years, I'd convinced myself it was love that made me carry her. But love without boundaries becomes slavery, and I was done being her mule. And here's the thing about sabotage. It doesn't need fireworks. It thrives in silence. Danica didn't know what I was doing as I sat at my kitchen table, sipping tea while on hold with another bank representative. She didn't hear the click of systems shutting her out, the invisible locks I was placing on doors she had always assumed would stay open. She wouldn't know until the next morning or the next week, when her world began to collapse in places she thought were unshakable. That night, as I closed the last account, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. My hands no longer shook. My chest no longer ached. It was as though I had been carrying a weight across decades and had finally set it down. My daughter had told me to die. Instead, I chose to let her live, but this time live on her own. Without my money, without my shield, without me. People think revenge is loud, that it's about confrontation, shouting, scenes that draw crowds. No, the sharpest revenge is quiet. It's the slow tightening of ropes, the invisible hand withdrawing, the silence that leaves someone gasping when the support they never acknowledged vanishes overnight. And as I watched the strings fall loose, one after another, I realized something chilling. My daughter had never been standing on her own. She had only been dangling, held up by me, and now, for the first time in her life, she was about to fall. Some truths feel like fire in the mouth. You can't hold them without being burned. I carried the knowledge of Micah's real father, like hot coals pressed against my tongue, and I knew I couldn't keep it there forever. Quentin deserved to know. Not because I loved him, not because I owed him loyalty, but because lies rot faster when they stay hidden. And this one was already seeping through the cracks of their marriage. I called him to meet me one evening, away from Danica, away from Micah, away from the stage where my daughter performed her perfect family act. He came to my house, shoulders slouched, his work uniform still creased from the day. He looked like a man carrying more weight than he could name, and I knew in my bones that what I was about to give him would crush him even further. "Sit down, Quentin," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. He looked at me, uneasy. He had probably expected another request for help around the house or some gentle mother-in-law talk. What he got instead was silence that stretched between us, heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that makes a man's breath falter. I placed the printed email from Osric Bennett on the table. His eyes skimmed it, then stilled. He went back to the top, reading slower this time, lips moving as though he couldn't trust his mind to hold the words. "My son, Tyrese, is Micah's father." The paper trembled in his hands. He blinked hard, shook his head, read it again. "No," he whispered. Just one word. But it wasn't denial. It was disbelief collapsing into horror. I slid another page across to him. Copies of messages Tyrese had shown me, dates, photos, receipts that aligned too perfectly with Danica's timeline. Quentin's hands dropped. He leaned back in the chair, staring at nothing. His chest rose and fell, his throat working to swallow air that wouldn't go down. "She lied to me," he finally said, his voice cracking, almost unrecognizable. "All these years. My boy." He stopped himself, the word boy catching in his throat. His face crumpled. "That's not my boy." I didn't answer. There was no cushion soft enough for this fall. The truth stood on its own, brutal, merciless. He pressed both palms to his face, elbows on his knees, rocking forward like the ground itself was trying to push him down. Minutes passed. Silence filled the room, except for the broken sounds of a man realizing his marriage had been built on a corpse of lies. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were bloodshot, wet, filled with something deeper than rage. It was devastation, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't throw fists, doesn't break furniture. The kind that hollows a man out and leaves him walking around as an empty shell. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Not long," I said, "but long enough to know you deserve the truth. Better to hear it from me than from the street." He nodded slowly, but the nod wasn't agreement. It was survival, the body's attempt to keep moving when the spirit is paralyzed. "She let me raise him," he muttered. "She let me claim him." She let me call him mine. His voice rose, shaking now, bitter. Do you know what that does to a man? To live in another man's shadow without knowing it. The silence that followed was unbearable. Quentin sat with his fists pressed to his knees, breathing ragged, like every inhale was a war. Then, suddenly, he stood. No goodbyes. No plans. Just stood and walked out the door, leaving it open behind him. I watched him disappear into the night, shoulders squared but shaking, and I knew there was no coming back from this. Betrayal in marriage isn't just between husband and wife. It bleeds outward, staining every life that touches theirs. Micah would feel it. The Bennetts would feel it. And Danica, she had no idea the bomb I had just dropped into her house, a bomb that would reduce her carefully curated life to rubble. And me, I closed the door, locked it, and sat in the dark. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the one carrying the weight. I felt like the one who had just set it down and walked away. Secrets rot fastest in sanctuaries. You'd think churches were built for grace, for shelter, for the tender work of forgiveness. But I've lived long enough to know better. Church pews hold people, and people love a scandal more than they love a sermon. Once the Bennetts pressed for visitation, the truth about Micah didn't just live in court documents or whispered arguments at home. It spilled into the very aisles where my daughter used to hold her head high. It began with murmurs, low and cautious, the way women in hats lean closer during announcements. Did you hear? They're saying Micah isn't Quentin's. Tyrese, the pastor's son. At first it was rumor, unconfirmed, floating like dust caught in sunlight. But once Osric himself admitted, softly but firmly, that his son had a right to see the boy, it was no longer gossip. It was fact. Danica had always strutted into church like she was untouchable. Her heels clicked against the floor like punctuation. Her hand on Quentin's arm, Micah perched on her hip in pressed outfits. People admired her, the young mother who had it all together, the wife with the solid home, the daughter of a woman known for strength. She loved that spotlight. She drank it down like cool water. But now, that light burned. People didn't look at her with admiration anymore. They studied her, dissected her, carved her open with their eyes. They whispered in corners, conversations halting when she passed. The mothers who once asked her advice on raising toddlers pulled their children closer, as though infidelity could rub off by proximity. And Quentin, he stopped sitting beside her. One Sunday, he didn't show up at all. His absence was its own sermon, louder than anything the pastor dared say from the pulpit. And then there was Osric, a man who had spent decades telling others to keep their houses in order, now standing at the center of a mess his own son had created. His voice carried authority, but behind it was shame. He wanted what was right. He claimed. He wanted his son to be a father to the boy he helped create. But the more he pushed, the more it exposed. Danica had to sit there week after week in a congregation that saw her not as a mother, but as a fraud. Micah, poor child, became the centerpiece of every whispered prayer request. Women laid hands on him like he was a lamb caught between wolves. They called him innocent, which he was, but in doing so, they named his mother guilty. Children repeated what they overheard at home. Soon, he came back from Sunday school, asking why people called him the pastor's grandson. His little voice, confused, was the cruelest echo of all. I watched from my own pew, stone still, listening to the ripple spread. People always imagine revenge as fire and fury, but Sometimes it's nothing more than sitting still while the truth makes its own noise. I didn't need to defend myself, didn't need to argue with Danica, didn't need to shout her lies from the rooftop. The congregation did it for me, each whisper another hammer to her carefully constructed facade. Danica tried to fight back. She wore brighter dresses, lifted her chin higher, smiled wider, as though performance could outshine reality. But no smile is wide enough to drown out betrayal once the congregation decides you're guilty. And church folk, they can crucify you with a hymn on their lips. What my daughter never understood is that image was her currency. She thrived on the approval of others, on the nods, the compliments, the invitations to lead. And once that approval was revoked, she was bankrupt in ways no money could fix. When the church turned cold, it didn't just cool the room, it iced her entire identity. And I sat in silence, letting her learn what I had known all along, a reputation built on lies as paper thin, and the slightest touch will tear it apart. There comes a moment when whispers no longer satisfy, when quiet claims harden into demands. For Tyrese Bennett, that moment arrived with the fury of a man who had been denied his blood for far too long. He was done asking politely. He was done standing in his father's shadow. He was done being erased. The first sign came in the form of a letter, formal and direct, from his attorney. I remember holding the envelope in my hands, the paper heavy, the ink sharp, as though even the document itself carried the weight of generations. Petition for paternity and visitation rights. There it was, cold, legal, undeniable. Tyrese wasn't just knocking at the door anymore. He was tearing it off the hinges. Danica tried to shrug it off at first, brushing past it with the arrogance that had carried her through so many storms. He won't win, she hissed at me once, her voice tight, her nails digging crescents into her palm. Quentin is Micah's father. Period. But her bravado sounded hollow now, an empty echo in a house filled with eviction notices and unpaid bills. And Quentin, he had already started pulling away, his silence louder than any lawyer's argument. When Tyrese filed his petition, it did more than call Danica's bluff. It summoned the state itself into her living room. Court dates were set, DNA tests ordered, affidavits drafted. And with each step, the truth she had hidden for years crept closer to daylight. I will never forget the look on Danica's face the day the test results came back. She sat stiff in her chair, her lipstick bleeding at the edges, her hands trembling against the manila folder. The paper declared it in numbers no denial could erase. 99.9% probability Tyrese Bennett is the biological father of Micah Hollins. Science had spoken, and in that moment, the lie she had built her life on collapsed into dust. Tyrese didn't gloat when the results came through. He didn't have to. He simply stood taller, his voice steadier, his claim finally validated. I want to see my son, he said, not as a plea this time, but as a right. His attorney filed for joint custody, and suddenly Danica's world was no longer hers to control. She had lived so long believing she could script her own reality, that her lies could bend truth into silence. But the court system does not bow to pride. It exposes, it documents, it binds with signatures that cannot be undone. And as news of the custody case spread, the church pews that once only whispered now gossiped openly. They're going to court. DNA doesn't lie. Imagine raising another man's child all these years. Danica, once the picture of composure, now walked into service looking hunted, The same people who once asked her to lead committees now watched her like spectators at a trial. Every nod, every murmur, every averted glance was a verdict before the judge ever banged the gavel. But the cruelest part, it wasn't the congregation. It wasn't even Quentin's silent withdrawal. It was Micah, innocent, bright-eyed, asking questions his mother couldn't answer. Why does Mr. Tyrese say, "He's my daddy"? Why is everyone saying that? Children are sponges. They absorb what adults leak. And no matter how Danica tried to wrap the truth in half answers, her son was starting to piece it together. I watched it all unfold, not with glee, but with a grim sense of inevitability. Danica thought she could silence a man's bloodline, that she could bury a truth under convenience and appearances. But Tyrese's persistence cracked that illusion open. He didn't storm her house, didn't scream at her doorstep. He simply stood up, declared what was his, and let the law do what lies never can, strip away denial until only truth remained. And with every filing, every hearing, every whispered conversation in the courthouse hallway, my daughter's pride shrank smaller and smaller. The woman who once told me to go die at the nursing home now sat in front of judges, reduced to just another defendant trying to defend the indefensible. The custody battle wasn't just looming, it was here. And no matter how Danica clawed at her image, no matter how she tried to twist the narrative, she could no longer hold back the tide. Tyrese had stepped forward, and with him came the full weight of the truth. If you've ever watched a house of cards topple, you know it doesn't fall gracefully. One piece shifts, another tilts, and in seconds what looked sturdy turns into a mess on the table. That was Danica's life, once I cut the strings. Everything she thought was hers, her house, her credit, her pride, was nothing more than borrowed air. And when the air disappeared, the crash came fast. It started with the phone calls. At first, polite voices asking for Mrs. Hollins to confirm payment. But politeness has an expiration date. Soon the calls grew sharper, colder, demanding. Your account is past due. This is your final warning. Danica, who once ignored my calls when she didn't feel like talking, now couldn't escape the ring of creditors pulling her name into their files. She muted her phone, then turned it off, but debt has a way of finding its voice again, through letters stamped in red, through notices slipped under doors, through knocks at hours meant for peace. The house went next. That pretty 3-bedroom with its beige siding and the front porch where she once posed for family photos was never really hers. She had confused stability with entitlement. The mortgage I had been covering slipped into default as soon as my payment stopped. Within weeks, foreclosure notices started arriving, their language blunt and merciless. By the time the neighbors caught wind, whispers circled like vultures, the Hollins place is in trouble. The yard grew unkempt, the porch light flickered out, and what was once a symbol of her status became a sign of decay. Then came the repossessions. One morning, she stepped outside to find her car gone, not stolen but reclaimed, towed off under the authority of a bank that no longer cared about her explanations. The neighbors watched from their driveways, some with pity, others with satisfaction, as the tow truck dragged away the very car she once boasted about affording. Later, when furniture trucks rolled in, hauling away appliances and items purchased on credit, the humiliation was complete. Danica had spent years crafting a life of appearances, but appearances don't pay bills. Reality does. Micah felt it too. The boy didn't understand debt or repossession. He only knew his favorite toy had disappeared along with the television, and his mother's voice was sharper, more frantic. He heard the arguments, the slammed doors, the cries muffled behind bathroom walls. Children don't need financial literacy to sense collapse. They feel it in the air, in the way their home no longer feels safe. Quentin's absence deepened the wound. Once the truth about Micah's paternity had settled into his bones, he began moving out, first in spirit, then in body. He stopped contributing what little he had, stopped showing up at family dinners, stopped answering Danica's desperate texts. By the time the eviction notice was posted, his things were already gone, his silence louder than the creditors. And through it all, Danica scrambled. She begged for extensions, promised payments she couldn't make, leaned on friends who quickly distanced themselves. Pride had once been her armor, but now pride was her prison. She couldn't ask for help without admitting the truth. She had never stood on her own. She had been propped up by me, shielded by my sacrifice, cushioned by money she never earned. Watching it unfold, I didn't celebrate. There was no joy in seeing my daughter reduced to rubble, but there was clarity. Every red-stamped notice, every empty driveway, every repossessed couch was a mirror reflecting back what I had always known. Without me, she was standing on sand. And when the tide came, it swept everything away. People like to think collapse happens slowly, that there's time to adjust, to catch your breath, to rebuild. But no, collapse happens all at once. One domino tips, and the rest rush forward, leaving nothing but dust where a house once stood. And that was Danica now, a woman choking on dust, staring at ruins, trying to understand how the castle she thought was permanent could crumble overnight. What she didn't know was this: the collapse wasn't sudden at all. It had been years in the making. She just never noticed the cracks until the whole house fell. It was late afternoon when she showed up, the kind of hour when the sun hovers low and spills long shadows across the yard. I wasn't expecting her, hadn't spoken to her in weeks, hadn't answered her calls. But there she was standing on my porch, her once polished hair unkempt, her clothes rumpled, her eyes swollen like she hadn't slept in days. For the first time in her life, my daughter looked small. Not stylish, not proud, not untouchable, just small. She knocked softly, then harder, then pressed her forehead against the door. "Mama," she whispered, her voice raw. "Please open up." I stood just inside, watching her through the curtain. My heart thudded, not with pity, but with the weight of every insult she'd ever hurled, every sacrifice she'd ever dismissed, every dollar she'd ever spent like it was owed to her. I opened the door, but only halfway, keeping the frame between us like a barrier she could no longer cross without my permission. Her eyes locked on mine, desperate. "I'm sorry," she blurted out, words tumbling like broken glass. "I didn't mean it that way, what I said. I was stressed, angry, I wasn't thinking. Please, Mama, you know I love you." I let her speak, let her scramble, let her drown in her own apologies. Tears streaked her face, and she clutched at the doorway as though it could anchor her. "The house is gone. Quentin left. The bills, I can't handle them. Micah, he needs stability. I need you. Please, Mama, don't do this to me." Her voice cracked on that last word. Me, even in her desperation, it was still about her. Not the years of sacrifice, not the truth she buried, not the boy she lied about. Always her. Always Danica. I leaned against the frame, my voice steady, measured. "Do you know what it's like," I said, To give someone your whole life and then be told the best gift you could give them is your death. She shook her head violently. I didn't mean it. I swear I didn't mean it. But you did, I said, my words sharp as stone. You meant it enough to say it. And you said it because you believed I was disposable. Just like you believed you could erase Tyrese, erase the truth, erase the years of sacrifice that built the life you took for granted. You thought everything would always be waiting for you, no matter how cruel you became. But you were wrong. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the porch, sobbing into her hands. Please, Mama, please. Don't leave me like this. I looked down at her, my only child begging at my feet, and I felt a mix of sorrow and steel. Sorrow for the little girl she once was, the one I carried on my back, the one I shielded from storms. Steel for the woman she had become, the one who spit on sacrifice and called it weakness. I knelt, just enough to meet her eyes. Danica, I said, my voice low, deliberate, this is the life you built. Not me. You. You made your choices, and now you're living in their shadow. I can't carry you anymore. I won't. Her sobs grew louder, her hands clawing at my arm, but I pulled back, rising to my feet. For the first time in decades, I turned my back on her and walked inside. The door clicked shut behind me, her cries muffled by the wood, fading with each step I took away from the porch. Inside, I leaned against the wall, my chest tight but my resolve unshaken. Walking away from your child is the hardest thing a mother can do, but sometimes the greatest act of love is letting them face the mirror they've avoided all their life. That was the last time I saw Danica as a daughter. From that day forward, she was just another adult, stripped of excuses, forced to reckon with the consequences she had spent years avoiding. And me? I chose silence. I chose absence. I chose freedom. Some betrayals are answered with anger, others with silence. But the deepest betrayal, being told by your own child to go die, deserves something colder than rage, sharper than silence. It deserves precision. That's why I called my attorney, Cornell Drayton, and asked him to draw up the documents that would carve my daughter out of my legacy like a surgeon cutting away dead flesh. Cornell had been with me for years, managing the details I never flaunted but always protected. My savings, my property, the quiet investments that kept me standing tall while Danica thought she was standing on her own. He welcomed me into his office, a place that smelled of leather and ink, walls lined with shelves of law books heavy enough to bury secrets. He offered me coffee. I declined. This wasn't a moment for comfort. It was a moment for clarity. I need to change my will. I told him. My voice was steady, almost detached. Danica Mays Hollins is to receive nothing. Not a dollar, not a trinket, not a memory. Cornell didn't flinch. He had seen families cut each other out before. But he raised an eyebrow, pen poised over his yellow pad. You're sure? More certain than I've ever been about anything, I said. He nodded, and the process began. Line by line, he drafted the language that would sever my daughter from everything she thought was waiting for her. The house I had quietly purchased in Virginia, the one she didn't even know existed, would pass to my sister Eunice, a woman who, despite our differences, had never once asked for more than I could give. The modest savings account Danica assumed was hers by default would be rerouted into scholarships for young nurses, girls like I once was who only needed a hand to climb higher. The jewelry, the heirlooms, the things my mother once pressed into my palm with trembling hands, would go to Eunice's grandchildren. Even the family photos, the albums Danica thought she would one day inherit, I instructed to be preserved in a foundation archive, not for her, but for history. Cornell read each line aloud, his voice crisp, the legal phrasing cold and final. The decedent's daughter, Danica Mays Hollins, shall not inherit, nor shall her descendants make any claim. Each sentence was another nail in the coffin of entitlement. I signed every page, slowly, deliberately. My hand didn't shake. My heart didn't race. In that moment, I felt the calm of a woman reclaiming her story. For years, I had been pouring into a well that never filled, funding a future that only mocked me in return. Now, with the stroke of a pen, I ended the cycle. Cornell slid the final document into a folder and tapped it twice. "It's done," he said. "Legally airtight. She has no claim." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling as though I had carried a weight across decades, and finally set it down. My legacy was no longer a leash. It was a blade, cutting away the ties that had bound me to her ungratefulness. When Danica begged on my porch, she thought my silence was the end of it. What she didn't know was that I had already written her out of my tomorrow. One day, when I am gone, she will expect a windfall, a safety net, a final rescue. Instead, she will find a will that names her absence in ink, a testament to the truth she refused to see. Love without respect cannot be inherited. Walking out of Cornell's office that day, the world felt sharper, cleaner. The sky over Virginia stretched wide, the air cool against my face. I thought of Danica scrambling in the ruins of her choices, and I thought of Micah, innocent, blameless, a child caught in a storm not of his making. My heart ached for him, but even he could not undo the damage his mother had done. The will was rewritten. The story was mine again. And for the first time in years, I felt free. People talk about death as the end. For me, it was leaving that house, that city, that life. I didn't die. I simply chose to stop living in a grave I had dug with my own sacrifices. 2 days after I signed away Danica's inheritance, I stood in the quiet of my bedroom with a suitcase open on the bed. Not a dramatic exit, not a scene fit for television, just me folding clothes, wrapping a few photographs in towels, and deciding which pieces of my life were worth carrying into the next chapter. I packed lightly. Years of giving had taught me the difference between what weighs you down and what sets you free. A few dresses, sturdy shoes, my mother's Bible with her handwriting in the margins. The rest could stay behind. I was done dragging reminders of a daughter who only saw me as a credit line and an inconvenience. The house I chose was not new to me. It was one I had purchased years earlier in secret. A modest brick bungalow tucked into the hills of Virginia, quiet and unassuming, a place no one in Danica's circle even knew existed. I had bought it with the kind of foresight only mothers have. A backup plan, a just-in-case. At the time, I told myself it was security. Now, I realized it was salvation. I remember the drive clearly. The miles stretched out like an unwinding cord. Each state line I crossed slicing another tether between me and the life I was leaving. The highway lights blurred into streaks. And for once, I didn't think about who was calling, what bill needed paying, whose needs should come before mine. I thought only about the road and the promise of solitude waiting at its end. When I finally pulled up to that little house, the porch light flickering dim against the twilight, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: peace. not happiness, not joy, not even relief. Just peace. The kind that comes when you know no one can find you unless you want to be found. The kind that comes when you close a door behind you and realize no one else has a key. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen that smelled faintly of cedar. But it was mine, entirely mine. Every corner, every creak in the floorboards, every quiet dawn belonged to me alone. I walked through the rooms, touching walls like you touch the skin of a newborn, feeling the pulse of a life beginning. I didn't leave a note for Danica. I didn't call her to explain. Why explain absence to someone who wished you gone? She told me the greatest gift I could give her was to die in a nursing home. So I gave her the next best thing, my disappearance from her world. To her, it would feel like a death. To me, it was rebirth. In Virginia, I planted a garden. I brewed coffee in silence. I learned the rhythm of my own days without interruptions, without demands. The neighbors waved politely but didn't ask questions, and I gave them nothing to wonder about. I became invisible by choice, and invisibility felt like power. Danica never knew the address. She searched, I'm sure, called my old friends, maybe even begged Cornell for information. But Cornell was loyal, bound by law and by his word. My will was sealed, my location untraceable. For the first time in my life, my daughter had no access to me, no way to pull, no way to demand, no way to diminish me. People say revenge is fire, a blaze that consumes everything in its path. But mine was quieter. My revenge was absence. My revenge was a life lived fully, peacefully, without her shadow pressing down on me. She had asked for my death, but what I gave her instead was worse. I kept on living in a way she could never touch, never control, never ruin. And in that little Virginia house, as the seasons turned and the years stretched on, I discovered the truth. Sometimes the loudest way to leave is in silence. I never called her, never wrote, never sent a card, a letter, a trace of where I'd gone. But life has a way of delivering news to your doorstep even when you don't ask for it. From Virginia, I kept my silence, yet pieces of Danica's downfall still reached me, through neighbors who knew neighbors, through old church friends who spoke too freely on the phone, through legal notices that needed my signature as Micah's grandmother. I didn't chase the information, but it found me all the same. The first came with a whisper about Quentin. One afternoon, Eunice phoned, her voice carrying the kind of careful tone people use when they know they're delivering a wound. "He's gone, Laretha," she said simply. Gone from the house, gone from the marriage, gone from the life he once claimed with pride. After learning the truth about Micah, he'd packed his things in silence, and with each bag he carried out, he left behind a trail of humiliation that Danica could no longer sweep under the rug. He didn't shout, didn't rage, just walked away. Sometimes absence cuts sharper than anger. Then came the courts. Tyrese pushed harder than ever, and the system backed him. DNA doesn't lie. Judges don't entertain pride. The ruling was clear. Visitation granted. Shared custody recognized. Micah now had 2 households, one honest and one built on denial. The boy began spending weekends with the Bennetts, learning his father's voice, tracing the shape of his own nose in a man Danica had tried to erase. Each handoff at the courthouse was another dagger. She no longer controlled the story. The truth had been written into law, and the church, it had grown colder than a tomb. Once her stage, it became her courtroom. Women who used to admire her dresses now whispered about her shame. Invitations stopped. Eyes followed her down the aisle, not in admiration, but judgment. Even Osric, despite being entangled in the mess, stood taller than she did, because at least his family had acknowledged the truth. Danica's denial had made her the villain. And in the court of faith, villains are remembered longer than sinners who repent. I learned of her isolation piece by piece. How the mortgage company finally claimed the house, how she moved into a cramped apartment far from the life she once bragged about, how her friends thinned out like smoke, unwilling to be associated with scandal. How Micah, poor child, carried questions she couldn't answer. How she cried in parking lots, screamed at clerks, clawed at excuses that no one believed anymore. I listened. I absorbed. But I did not move. I did not call. I did not write. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I had already given her the gift she demanded, my disappearance. To step back into her life would be to undo the silence I had chosen. And silence was my revenge. From my little house in Virginia, I planted roses that bloomed blood red each spring. I brewed my coffee in peace. I read books I never had time for, walked trails where no one knew my name, and finally learned what it meant to live without obligation. My life was small, but it was mine, entirely mine. And every day I breathed free air. I thought of her words, "Go die at the nursing home." She thought my absence would be her relief. Instead, it became her ruin. Because here is the truth no one tells you. Sometimes the greatest punishment isn't what you do to a person. It's what you stop doing for them. Without me, her world collapsed. And from afar, I watched, not with joy, not with bitterness, but with the quiet certainty that justice had finally balanced the scales. When people imagine revenge, they picture fire. They picture shouting in the street, dramatic confrontations, a slammed door, a slap across the face. But revenge doesn't always wear noise. Sometimes it comes dressed in silence, carrying no weapon but absence. That is the kind I chose. Danica wanted me gone, dead in a nursing home, forgotten in a room with white walls and no windows. What she didn't expect was that I would take her at her word and vanish on my own terms. Not into death, but into life. A life she could not reach, could not control, could not drain. By moving to Virginia, by cutting her off completely, I gave her exactly what she asked for, but in a form she could never undo. I revoked her inheritance not out of spite, but out of principle. For too long, I had taught her that my sacrifices were endless, that my money was hers to waste, that my future was a cushion for her recklessness. To leave her my estate would have been to reward her contempt. So I carved her out of it, stripped her name from my legacy, and gave those resources to people who would honor them. With every signature, I reclaimed what was mine, not just the money, but the dignity she had tried to bury. People will ask, did I stop loving her? No. Love was never the issue. Respect was. Love without respect is a chain, and I broke that chain. I chose myself, not in bitterness, but in liberation. I chose to breathe air unclouded by her lies, to walk through days where my worth was not mocked, to leave behind a silence so loud it would echo through every corner of her downfall. And make no mistake, absence is louder than anger. Anger gives the other person power. It shows them they still live rent-free in your heart. Absence, though, it is final. It is the locked door they can't open, the call that never comes, the will that names their absence in ink. It is the grave they dug for you, only to find themselves buried in it instead. 2 days before my 68th birthday, my daughter told me to die. Instead, I lived. I lived beyond her reach, beyond her grasp, beyond her cruelty. I planted gardens. I woke up to quiet mornings. I let the sun touch my face without the shadow of her demands. And from afar, I watched her world collapse, not because I cursed her, but because I stopped carrying her. This is my final word. The greatest revenge is not fire, nor fury, nor violence. The greatest revenge is absence. It is walking away so completely that your presence becomes a ghost, haunting not by what you do, but by what you no longer give. She asked me to die. I gave her something far worse. I disappeared, and in doing so, I lived.